The worst part wasn't hearing my father insult me. It was hearing everyone else laugh. I was sitting in my car outside Mercy General Hospital after a 12-hour shift, still wearing scrubs that smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee, when my dad accidentally changed my entire life with one phone call. "Lauren doesn't need to know yet," he said. At first I thought he was still talking to me. We'd just finished arguing about Sunday dinner at my aunt's house. But then I heard shuffling, another voice, and realized he'd forgotten to hang up. "She'll make everything emotional like she always does," my sister Brittany said, laughing softly. And then my father laughed too. Not awkwardly. Not uncomfortably. Like he genuinely found me pathetic. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. My chest felt hot. Not angry at first. Just embarrassed. Because suddenly every family gathering from the last 10 years started replaying in my head, and for the first time, I realized maybe none of it had been accidental. "Honestly," my dad continued, "she should just be grateful we let her stay involved at all. Brittany actually built something with her life." More laughter. I froze. "I'm 34 years old and I still wish I could tell you hearing your own father talk about you like that stops hurting once you become an adult. It doesn't. Especially when you've spent your entire life trying to earn approval that never comes." Then Brittany said something that made my stomach drop. "Did you move the paperwork already?" "Yeah," Dad answered casually. "She won't see it before Sunday." There was another pause. Then my father said the sentence that changed everything. "Lauren stays quiet. That's what she does." Silence. I could actually hear them moving around in the kitchen at my aunt's house. Completely relaxed. Completely confident. Like they'd already won something I didn't even know we were fighting over. And that's when something inside me shifted. Because they were right about one thing. I had stayed quiet. For years. I stayed quiet when Brittany got praised for things I got ignored for. I stayed quiet when my father forgot my birthday twice but somehow never missed one of her dance recitals growing up. I stayed quiet when relatives introduced me as the sensitive one, while Brittany was the successful one. I stayed quiet because I kept thinking eventually my family would see me clearly if I just loved them hard enough. But sitting in that dark parking lot with tears running down my face while my own father mocked me in the background, I realized my silence had never protected me. It had protected them. My name is Lauren Mitchell. I'm 34 years old and I work as a respiratory therapist in Columbus, Ohio. Most people wouldn't look at my life and think there's anything remarkable about it. I rent a small townhouse. I work long shifts. I drive a car that makes weird noises every winter. And unlike my younger sister Brittany, I never became the kind of person my family bragged about at church dinners. Brittany married young, married wealthy, and somehow mastered the art of making ordinary things sound impressive. She could post a picture holding a coffee cup and my relatives would comment like she'd cured a disease. Meanwhile, I was the person they called when somebody got sick. Or needed help moving. Or needed money quietly loaned without judgment. I became useful instead of valued. And the hardest part is, I let it happen. Because my grandmother Evelyn raised me to believe family mattered more than pride. She used to squeeze my hand and tell me, "Being kind doesn't mean being weak, Lauren." Back then I believed her. But kindness gets complicated when people start confusing it with permission. The truth is, by the time that phone call happened, I was already exhausted emotionally. 3 months earlier my grandmother passed away after a long battle with heart failure. And losing her felt like losing the only person in my family who actually saw me. At the funeral, people cried and hugged and talked about how much she loved everyone equally. But even then I noticed something strange. My father and Brittany kept disappearing into side rooms whispering together. Every time I walked near them, conversations stopped. I told myself I was imagining things. That grief makes people paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. And now, hearing that phone call, I finally understood. Whatever they were hiding involved my grandmother. I wiped my face, stared through the windshield for a long time, and listened to my father keep talking about me like I was some burden he'd spent years tolerating. And honestly, that hurt more than the betrayal itself. Because part of me still wanted him to love me. Even then. Especially then. I should have hung up immediately. Instead, I listened to every word. And before that night ended, I heard something else that would make Sunday dinner one of the most humiliating nights of my life. I barely slept before Sunday dinner. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my father's voice again. "Lauren stays quiet." It kept replaying in my head like a song I couldn't shut off. By the time I drove to my Aunt Denise's house that evening, I already knew something bad was coming. I just didn't know how far they were willing to go. My aunt lived in one of those large suburban homes designed to look warm and welcoming but somehow always felt cold once you stepped inside. The driveway was packed with cars when I arrived. Family dinner. That phrase used to comfort me. Now it just made my stomach tight. I sat in my car for an extra minute watching people through the windows. My cousins laughed around the kitchen island while Brittany stood near the dining room showing someone pictures on her phone. She looked happy, confident, like someone who already knew the ending of the story. When I finally walked inside, conversations shifted slightly. Not enough for outsiders to notice, but enough for me. You know how families can communicate entire sentences without speaking? That's what it felt like. My aunt hugged me quickly. "Lauren, honey, you made it." "Wouldn't miss it," I said softly. And I meant that sarcastically. But she either didn't notice or pretended not to. Brittany turned toward me wearing this cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. "There she is," she said brightly. "How's work?" "Tiring," I answered. "Well, at least you're good at helping people." At first glance it sounded polite. But Brittany had mastered the art of sounding supportive while quietly making you feel small. Before I could answer, my father walked into the kitchen carrying a tray of drinks. "Lauren," he said casually, like he hadn't humiliated me over the phone 48 hours earlier. I stared at him for a second too long. He noticed. His smile tightened. "You okay?" "Long week," I replied. And for a moment I wondered if guilt would show up on his face. It didn't. That was the thing that scared me most. He genuinely believed he'd done nothing wrong. Dinner started normally enough. Too normally. Everyone laughed louder than necessary. Complimented Brittany more than usual. Avoided eye contact with me in weird little moments. I kept waiting for the real reason we were all there. Then halfway through dinner my father tapped his glass with a fork. The room quieted instantly. And suddenly I couldn't breathe right. "I wanted to talk about the house," he said. There was my grandmother's house. The place she'd lived for 42 years. The place where she taught me how to bake peach cobbler and let me sleep beside her during thunderstorms when I was little. The only house that had ever truly felt safe to me. My father smiled toward Brittany and her husband Eric. "As most of you know," he continued, "Brittany and Eric are preparing to start a family." Several relatives nodded approvingly. "And after discussing what's best for everyone, we've decided they'll be moving into Mom's house." The room erupted into supportive comments immediately. "Oh, that's wonderful. Your grandmother would have loved that." "So exciting." I just sat there staring at him. Because my grandmother promised me repeatedly that the house would be divided fairly after she passed. Not because she favored me, but because she believed fairness mattered. I remember asking her once why she wrote everything down so carefully. And she told me, "Families get strange when grief and money meet each other." At the time I laughed. Now I understood exactly what she meant. I finally spoke carefully. "I thought Grandma wanted the house split evenly." Silence. Not shocked silence. Prepared silence. Like everyone had already rehearsed this conversation without me. My father leaned back in his chair slowly. "Well," he said, "circumstances change." Brittany crossed her arms gently. "And honestly, Lauren, it just makes more sense this way." I looked at her. "What does that mean?" Eric jumped in before she could answer. "You don't really need a whole house." There was that subtle judgment. Single woman. No husband. No children. Therefore somehow less deserving. I felt heat rush into my face. "I never said I wanted the whole house," I replied carefully. "I'm asking why nobody talked to me about this before deciding." My father sighed dramatically like I was exhausting him. "Because we knew you'd turn it into a problem." That hit hard. Especially because several relatives immediately avoided eye contact. Which meant they agreed. Or at least didn't disagree enough to defend me. I looked around the table slowly. "A problem," I repeated quietly. Brittany gave me this fake sympathetic expression I'll never forget. "Lauren, you've always been emotional about Grandma." Emotional. That word. Families love using it against women once they want to dismiss them without sounding cruel. I swallowed hard. "She was my grandmother too." "And she adored you," Brittany replied quickly. Nobody's denying that. Then she smiled. But we're thinking practically. Practically. Meaning Brittany's life counted more because it looked prettier on Christmas cards. I stared down at my untouched food for a second because I could feel tears building, and I absolutely refused to cry in front of them. Not again. Then my father delivered the final blow. Lauren, he said calmly, you don't even have a family to pass the house down to someday. The room went silent. Every sound disappeared. Even the air felt different. Because he knew exactly where to hit me. 2 years earlier, I'd gone through a devastating miscarriage after a complicated pregnancy. Most of my family barely talked about it afterward because uncomfortable grief didn't fit their polished image. But my father knew. And he used it anyway. I looked at him in complete disbelief. Dad. But he kept going. You need to stop taking everything so personally. I heard my aunt whisper, Tom. Like even she knew he'd crossed a line. But Brittany just sat there quietly. Not defending me. Not stopping him. Just letting it happen. That hurt almost worse. Because humiliation feels different when someone watches it happen comfortably. I pushed my chair back slowly. You already decided all of this before tonight, didn't you? Nobody answered. And that was answer enough. Then Brittany said something soft enough to sound innocent but sharp enough to cut deep. We didn't think you'd understand. I nodded slowly. Because finally, everything made sense. The whispers. The missing paperwork. The phone call. The strange looks at the funeral. They hadn't forgotten me. They'd intentionally excluded me. And sitting there in my grandmother's dining room surrounded by people who spent years calling themselves family, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't spontaneous betrayal. This had been building for a very long time. And what they still didn't know was that my grandmother had prepared for exactly this kind of moment. I left dinner before dessert. Nobody stopped me. That's the part one remember most clearly. Not my father staring down at his plate. Not Brittany pretending she felt bad. Not my aunt whispering, maybe give her space. It was the fact that nobody followed me outside. I walked to my car feeling completely numb. Like my body was moving but my brain hadn't caught up yet. I sat behind the steering wheel for almost 20 minutes staring at my grandmother's old casserole dish in the passenger seat. My aunt had packed leftovers for me out of habit. And somehow that tiny act of kindness almost broke me more than the humiliation itself. Because grief sneaks up on you in weird moments. Not always during funerals. Sometimes it happens in parking lots holding mashed potatoes nobody wanted you to take home. By the time I got home that night I felt emotionally hollow. I kicked off my shoes, dropped my purse by the couch and finally let myself cry. Not delicate movie tears either. The ugly kind. The kind where your chest hurts and you can barely breathe because everything you've spent years ignoring suddenly crashes into you at once. I cried for my grandmother. For the baby I lost. For every family dinner where I laughed off comments that secretly wounded me. For every time I convinced myself I was imagining favoritism because admitting the truth felt too painful. And mostly, I cried because a part of me still wanted my father to choose me. Even after everything. That realization humiliated me almost as much as the dinner itself. Around midnight my phone buzzed. Brittany. I stared at the screen for a long time before answering. Hello. Her voice came soft and careful. Lauren, are you okay? I actually laughed a little. Not because anything was funny. Because sometimes people become so unbelievable you don't know what else to do. You let Dad use my miscarriage against me. Silence. Then Brittany sighed. He didn't mean it like that. I closed my eyes. Of course. Defend him first. Always. You sat there and watched it happen. You're twisting this. No, I said quietly. I think I'm finally seeing it clearly. That irritated her immediately. You always do this. Do what? Turn yourself into the victim. There was again. The family narrative. Lauren's too sensitive. Lauren exaggerates. Lauren makes things emotional. I leaned back against the couch and suddenly felt exhausted beyond words. You know what's interesting? I asked softly. What? Nobody ever says I'm wrong. They just say I'm emotional. She didn't answer. Because she knew I was right. Then her tone changed completely. Colder. More defensive. Look, Grandma wanted the house to stay in the family. It is staying in the family. You know what I mean. And there it was again. That subtle implication that because I wasn't married anymore, Because I didn't have children. Because my life didn't look like Brittany's. I somehow counted less. I swallowed hard. You already moved paperwork, didn't you? Another silence. Too long. Dad handled everything. So that's a yes. Lauren. You knew I overheard that phone call, didn't you? Dead silence. I sat upright instantly. Because people don't go quiet like that unless they're caught. Oh my God, I whispered. Brittany exhaled sharply. He forgot to hang up. It wasn't intentional. But afterward you still went through with this. Because honestly, she snapped suddenly. You make everything harder than it needs to be. That sentence changed something inside me permanently. Not louder. Not dramatic. Just permanent. Because for the first time in my life, I realized my family didn't see me as a person with feelings. They saw me as an obstacle. A complication. Something inconvenient standing between them and what they wanted. I hung up without another word. Then I sat there in silence staring at my grandmother's old recipe box on the shelf near my kitchen. A faded blue tin with tiny yellow flowers painted on top. Most people would have seen junk. But my grandmother hid important things inside ordinary objects. And suddenly I remembered something she told me 3 weeks before she died. If anything ever feels wrong after I'm gone, she whispered from her hospital bed, look where I keep the recipes nobody likes. At the time I thought the medication was confusing her. Now my hands started shaking. I stood up immediately and grabbed the tin. Inside were recipe cards, faded notes, old grocery lists. And underneath them, an envelope. My name written across the front in my grandmother's handwriting. I stopped breathing for a second. Because suddenly the room felt too quiet. Too still. I opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter. And a second smaller envelope. I unfolded the letter first. Lauren, if you're reading this, then I was probably right to worry. Families don't always become kinder after funerals. Sometimes they become strangers. I know you think being quiet keeps peace, sweetheart. But silence only works when everyone involved has a conscience. Tears instantly blurred my vision. I kept reading. There are things you don't know about this family. Things I hoped would never matter. But if they start treating you unfairly, I need you to speak to Daniel Harper. He has copies of everything. My stomach dropped. Daniel Harper. My grandmother's attorney. The same attorney my father claimed had already finalized everything. My pulse started pounding. I grabbed the second envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a key. And a storage unit number. I actually sat down on the kitchen floor. Because suddenly none of this felt accidental anymore. My grandmother knew. Somehow. She knew this would happen. Then I noticed one final line at the bottom of the letter. And it sent chills through me. Your father has been hiding things for years. I stared at those words over and over again. Part of me wanted to reject them immediately. Because no matter how hurt I felt, believing my father intentionally deceived people for years felt impossible. But another part of me, the exhausted part, the honest part, already knew it was true. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Brittany. It was my cousin Rachel. Now Rachel was basically the family outsider. She moved to Chicago years earlier after fighting constantly with my father and several relatives. Most people in the family described her as difficult, which usually means someone who stopped tolerating disrespect. I answered cautiously. Hey. Rachel didn't waste time. So, she said calmly, you finally saw who these people really are. I frowned slightly. What? I heard about dinner. Of course she did. Nothing travels faster than family gossip after humiliation. But then Rachel said something strange. You need to stop assuming this is only about the house. A cold feeling spread through my chest. What does that mean? There was a pause. And then she answered quietly. Lauren, your grandmother tried to warn me about your father 2 years ago. I didn't sleep at all after Rachel's phone call. I just sat in my kitchen until sunrise staring at my grandmother's letter while every memory I had of my father started rearranging itself inside my head. It's terrifying when someone you love suddenly begins making sense in the worst possible way. By 7 in the morning I finally called off work. That alone told me how serious this had become. I never called off. Not after the miscarriage. Not after my divorce. Not even when I had pneumonia 3 winters ago and nearly passed out during a shift. But that morning I couldn't pretend my life was normal anymore. I drove straight to the storage unit address from the envelope. It was on the edge of town behind an old hardware store, The kind of place nobody notices unless they're specifically looking for it. Gray metal buildings. Security gate. Tiny cameras mounted above every door. I sat in my car gripping the key for almost a minute before going inside. Part of me still hoped this would turn out harmless. Maybe old photos. Family heirlooms. Something sentimental. Instead, I unlocked the unit and found my entire understanding of my family waiting inside cardboard boxes. There were at least 15 of them. Neatly labeled in my grandmother's handwriting. Texas. Property records. Medical paperwork. Bank documents. Letters. And sitting right in the center. A small fireproof safe. I stared at it feeling physically sick. Because normal families don't leave secret storage units behind. Normal grandmothers don't hide evidence. My hands trembled while I opened the first box. Inside were folders organized by year. At first nothing looked unusual. Then I found my name. A folder labeled, Lauren Education Fund. I opened it slowly. And my stomach dropped. There were bank withdrawal records going back nearly 12 years. Large withdrawals. Repeatedly. Signed by my father. I sat down hard on the cold concrete floor. Because suddenly I understood why my college savings disappeared so mysteriously during my sophomore year. Back then, Dad claimed the stock market crashed and Grandma's investments suffered losses. I remembered crying in my dorm parking lot while he explained why I needed student loans now. I remembered apologizing to him for being expensive. I actually apologized. Meanwhile, he'd been taking the money himself. I covered my mouth trying not to panic. Then I found something worse. Several withdrawals matched dates connected to Brittany's wedding. Down payment on her house. Luxury honeymoon expenses. Even furniture purchases. My education fund helped finance my sister's perfect life. I physically couldn't process it. The humiliation hit harder than anger at first. Because betrayal from strangers hurts differently than betrayal from people who watched you suffer and stayed quiet anyway. I kept digging through paperwork. And every new document made things uglier. My father borrowed money repeatedly from my grandmother under the excuse of temporary emergencies. But many payments were never returned. There were handwritten notes from Grandma asking about repayment. Then eventually, frustration, disappointment, fear. One letter stopped me cold. Thomas, you need to stop treating Lauren's future like it belongs to everyone except her. I warned you already. Brittany is not entitled to everything simply because she demands it louder. I stared at the page for a long time. Because hearing my grandmother acknowledge the favoritism so directly shattered something inside me. He saw it. All those years. He saw it. And maybe that should have comforted me. Instead it made me grieve her all over again. Around noon Rachel arrived. I hadn't even told her where I was. Which honestly didn't surprise me. Rachel always had a weird ability to appear exactly when things fell apart. She walked into the storage unit holding 2 coffees and stopped when she saw the boxes spread around me. "Oh," she whispered quietly. "Yeah," I answered. She sat beside me on the floor carefully. For a minute neither of us spoke. Then she finally asked, "How bad is it?" I handed her the folder silently. She flipped through a few pages and closed her eyes. That bastard. Hearing someone speak about my father like that should have upset me. Instead I just felt tired. Rachel leaned back against the wall. "You know he did something similar to my mom years ago, right?" I looked at her sharply. "What?" "She loaned him money after his construction business failed. Grandma helped cover part of it quietly because she didn't want the family embarrassed." My chest tightened. "Nobody told me this." "Of course not. Your dad survives by controlling the story everybody hears." That sentence sat heavily between us. Because it explained so much. My father always positioned himself as the responsible one. The respected one. The family leader. And suddenly I realized how carefully that image had been protected. Rachel pointed toward the safe in the center of the unit. "You opened that yet?" I shook my head. "No. Maybe we should." The key for the safe was taped beneath my grandmother's letter. My fingers shook while unlocking it. Inside were several sealed envelopes. One addressed to Daniel Harper. One addressed to me. And one labeled, "If necessary." Rachel stared at it. "Well, that's terrifying." I almost laughed despite everything. Almost. I opened the envelope addressed to me first. Inside was another handwritten note. "Lauren, If you've reached this point, then I'm afraid things became worse than I hoped. I wanted to believe your father would eventually choose honesty over pride. But pride is a hungry thing. Once people feed it long enough, they start sacrificing others to protect it. There was also a flash drive. And suddenly my pulse started racing again. What's on that? Rachel asked. I don't know. But deep down, I already knew it wouldn't be good. We drove straight to Rachel's hotel afterward because I couldn't bring myself to go home yet. The entire drive felt surreal. Like I'd stepped into somebody else's family tragedy by mistake. Once inside her room, Rachel plugged the flash drive into her laptop. At first there were only scanned documents. Financial statements. Emails. Property records. Then we found audio files. My stomach twisted immediately. No, I whispered. Rachel looked at me carefully. You sure? I wasn't. But I clicked one anyway. And suddenly my father's voice filled the room. You can move Lauren's portion temporarily, he said. She won't ask questions. I froze instantly. The recording sounded old. Years old. Another man answered nervously, Tom, this is risky. It's family money, my father snapped. It'll go back eventually. But according to the records sitting beside me, it never did. I felt physically sick. Not because of the money anymore. Because of how easily he said my name. Like stealing from me was ordinary. Like my future was negotiable. Rachel slowly closed the laptop. Lauren. But I couldn't answer. Because the truth was finally unavoidable now. This wasn't favoritism anymore. This wasn't emotional neglect. My father knowingly sacrificed my future to maintain Brittany's life and his reputation. And somehow they all expected me to stay quiet forever. Then Rachel said something that made the entire situation even darker. You realize Brittany probably knows more than she admits, right? I looked at her immediately. No. Rachel held my gaze carefully. She benefits too much not to. That sentence followed me for days. She benefits too much not to. At first I tried rejecting it. Because accepting my father's betrayal was one thing. Accepting Brittany's involvement felt unbearable. When we were kids, Brittany used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. She cried at my high school graduation because she said she'd miss me when I left for college. After my miscarriage, she brought groceries to my apartment and sat with me for hours while I barely spoke. Those memories didn't disappear just because I discovered ugly truths. That's the hardest part about family betrayal. People are rarely monsters all the time. Sometimes they love you sincerely while still hurting you repeatedly. And that confusion can keep you trapped for years. 3 days after finding the storage unit, I met with Daniel Harper, my grandmother's attorney. His office smelled like old paper and coffee, and he looked exactly how you'd expect a family attorney nearing retirement to look. Gray hair. Wire-frame glasses. Exhausted eyes that had probably witnessed too many inheritance disasters. The moment I walked into his office, his expression softened. You look just like Evelyn when you're upset, he said quietly. And for some reason that nearly made me cry. Daniel motioned for me to sit. Rachel stayed beside me silently. Then Daniel folded his hands together carefully. I was wondering when you'd come. You knew about all of this? I asked. His face tightened immediately. I knew enough to worry. He explained that my grandmother contacted him privately almost 2 years earlier after discovering inconsistencies in financial records connected to my father. Apparently she confronted him multiple times. And every time my father promised he would fix everything. But he never did. Instead he doubled down on appearances. Protecting his image became more important than honesty. Daniel opened a thick folder in front of him. Your grandmother changed several estate instructions 6 months before she passed. My heart started pounding. She named you co-executor. I blinked. What? She no longer trusted major financial decisions being handled solely by your father. Rachel muttered, good for her. But I could barely think straight. Then why did Dad act like everything was already finalized? Daniel sighed deeply. Because technically nothing could move forward legally without your signature. Silence. I stared at him. Then slowly, painfully the full picture came together. The rushed family dinner. The hidden paperwork. The pressure. The humiliation. They weren't just excluding me emotionally. They were trying to manipulate me into surrendering quietly. My father assumed shame would keep me compliant. And honestly, For most of my life he probably would have been right. Daniel slid another document across the desk. This is where things become serious. I looked down. It was an official accounting request tied to the estate. Missing funds. Unexplained transfers. Irregular withdrawals. Amounts far larger than I imagined. My throat tightened. How much? Daniel hesitated. Over 300,000 across multiple years. I physically stopped breathing for a second. $300,000. Gone. And suddenly my student loans, my second jobs during college, my tiny apartment after graduation, all of it looked different now. I wasn't struggling because life happened randomly. I was struggling because someone made choices about my future without my permission. Rachel leaned forward sharply. Can criminal charges happen? Daniel chose his next words carefully. If fraud can be proven intentionally, potentially. The room went completely silent. Because suddenly this wasn't just family drama anymore. This could destroy my father's entire life. And despite everything, that realization still hurt. I looked down at my hands quietly. I don't want revenge. Daniel nodded slowly. Most decent people don't. I just want the truth. And sometimes, he said gently, truth carries consequences whether we want it to or not. A few hours later my phone exploded with messages. Apparently my father had learned I met with Daniel. Dad, why are you involving lawyers? Dad, call me immediately. Dad, don't make this uglier than it needs to be. That last text made something cold settle inside me. Because even now, even after years of deception, his biggest concern was appearance. Not apology. Not accountability. Just control. Then Brittany called. I almost ignored it. But something told me I needed to hear her voice. Lauren, she said immediately, sounding panicked. What are you doing? I laughed softly in disbelief. That's your opening line? Dad's freaking out. Interesting. Please don't do this. Do what exactly? Ask questions. You know what I mean. No, I said calmly. Actually, I don't anymore. She exhaled shakily. You're blowing this out of proportion. I closed my eyes. Even now she still needed me to feel irrational so she wouldn't have to feel guilty. Did you know? I asked quietly. Silence. My voice cracked slightly. Brittany, did you know where the money came from? No, she answered too quickly. And that's when I knew she was lying. Maybe not about all of it. But enough. Enough to avoid asking harder questions. Enough to enjoy benefits she suspected came at my expense. I sat down slowly on my couch. How long? Lauren, how long did you know things weren't right? Her breathing got shaky. Dad said he was protecting the family. There was not denial, justification. Tears filled my eyes instantly. As somehow that hurt even more. You let me drown in debt. That's not fair. No, I whispered. None of this is fair. Then Brittany started crying. And for a second old instincts kicked in. Comfort her. Fix this. Make everyone feel okay again. But I stopped myself. Because I finally understood something important. My entire life I'd been carrying emotional responsibility for people who never carried mine. Brittany's voice broke through the phone. You don't understand the pressure Dad put on everybody. I frowned slightly. What does that mean? Another long silence. Then she said something unexpected. He's been lying to all of us for years. I sat upright instantly. What? You think you were the only target? She asked bitterly. Dad built this perfect image and forced everybody to maintain it. That caught me off guard completely. Because for the first time, Brittany didn't sound superior. She sounded exhausted. He told me if I questioned him, she whispered, he'd cut Eric out of the business. A cold feeling spread through my chest. How much did you know? Enough to hate myself for it. Silence swallowed both of us. Then she started crying harder. I didn't know about your college fund until last year. I closed my eyes. Last year. Meaning she sat through family dinners. Holidays. Phone calls. Knowing. And never told me. I was scared, she whispered. And maybe she was telling the truth. But fear stops being an excuse once it starts destroying somebody else's life. Then she said something I never expected. Dad's meeting everyone Saturday to announce renovations on Grandma's house. I frowned. What? He thinks if he moves fast enough, people will support him publicly before legal stuff comes out. Of course he did. My father always believed confidence could outrun consequences. Brittany inhaled shakily. Lauren, if you're going to expose this, do it before Saturday. I went still. Because suddenly I realized something terrifying. My family still thought this story belonged to my father. They had no idea I finally had the truth. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of being the difficult daughter anymore. Saturday arrived gray and cold. The kind of weather where the sky looks heavy before a storm. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror for almost 10 minutes holding my grandmother's necklace in my hand. Simple gold chain. Tiny sapphire pendant. Nothing flashy. But she wore it every single day. The last time I saw her conscious in the hospital, she pressed it into my palm and whispered, "One day you'll stop apologizing for taking up space." At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. Now I did. I fastened the necklace around my neck, took a slow breath and walked out the door. The family gathering was being held at my grandmother's church hall. Of course it was. Because my father loved public respectability more than honesty. By the time Rachel and I arrived, the parking lot was already full. Through the windows, I could see relatives mingling around tables covered in catered food while soft music played in the background. It looked less like a memorial gathering and more like a campaign event. Rachel glanced at me carefully. "You sure you're ready for this?" "Oh, absolutely not." But I nodded anyway. The second we walked inside, conversations shifted. I felt it instantly. People knew tension existed now. They just didn't know how much. My father stood near the front of the room wearing one of his expensive gray suits, smiling and shaking hands like a politician. Brittany sat beside Eric at one of the center tables looking pale and emotionally drained. The moment she saw me, her expression tightened. Not angry. Terrified. Good, I thought. For once, somebody besides me understood what fear felt like in this family. Dad approached immediately. "Lauren," he said quietly, forcing a smile. "Can we talk privately?" "No." His jaw tightened. "You're embarrassing yourself." I almost laughed. Because hearing that from him now felt absurd. "I learned from the best." Rachel muttered, "Jesus," under her breath beside me. Dad lowered his voice sharply. "You need to stop this before you damage the family permanently." And there it was again. Not remorse. Not concern for me. Just panic over exposure. I held his gaze calmly. "You damaged this family years ago." For a second, something ugly flashed across his face. Not guilt. Resentment. Like he genuinely blamed me for discovering the truth. Then people started gathering near the front as my aunt tapped a microphone lightly. "Okay, everyone," she announced nervously. "Tom wanted to say a few words about Evelyn's legacy." Legacy. What a dangerous word. Dad walked confidently to the front of the room while relatives settled into chairs. I stayed standing near the back. Rachel beside me. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might get sick. Part of me still wanted to run. Because despite everything, confronting your own father publicly feels unnatural. Every childhood instinct screams at you to stay small and obedient. But then I remembered crying in my dorm parking lot over student loans he caused. I remembered my miscarriage being used against me at dinner. I remembered overhearing laughter while they discussed hiding paperwork from me. And suddenly standing still became easier than staying silent. Dad smiled warmly at the crowd. My mother believed family was everything. The hypocrisy nearly made me dizzy. He continued talking about unity, tradition, respect. Every word sounding polished and practiced. Then he gestured toward Brittany and Eric. "And I know Mom would be proud seeing the house remain with the next generation." That's not what she wanted. The words came out calm. Clear. Sharp enough to cut through the entire room instantly. Every head turned toward me. Dad froze mid-sentence. And suddenly the church hall became completely silent. I walked slowly toward the front. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just steady. My father stared at me with disbelief. "Lauren," he warned quietly. "No," I said. "You've had years to speak. It's my turn now." My hands were shaking so badly I kept them clasped together to hide it. But my voice stayed steady. That house wasn't supposed to belong to one person. Grandma documented that clearly before she died. Confused murmurs spread across the room immediately. Dad forced a laugh. "She's upset and misunderstanding legal details." I'm not misunderstanding anything. Then I pulled my phone out and pressed play. The recording filled the room instantly. Lauren stays quiet. That's what she does. My father's own voice echoed through the church hall. People went completely still. Then Brittany's voice followed. Did you move the paperwork already? Dad's face lost all color. Several relatives started whispering immediately. My aunt looked physically sick. I stopped the recording after a minute. Nobody spoke. Because suddenly the perfect family image cracked wide open right in front of them. Dad stepped toward me furiously. You recorded private conversations? You stole from your daughter. The room exploded into noise. What? Stole. Tom. My father looked around wildly like he could still regain control somehow. This is being twisted completely out of context. Rachel stepped forward immediately. $300,000 worth of context? Gasps spread across the room. Brittany covered her face with trembling hands. Dad pointed toward me aggressively. You have no idea what sacrifices I made for this family. I stared at him. And for the first time in my life, I truly saw him. Not as my father. Not as authority. Just a deeply insecure man who spent years feeding his ego with other people's futures. You used my college fund, I said quietly. You lied to Grandma. You manipulated everyone around you. And the worst part. My voice cracked slightly. You made me believe I deserved less. That hit him harder than the accusations. Because finally somebody was speaking honestly. Daniel Harper entered the room right then carrying a folder. Perfect timing. Several relatives turned toward him instantly. He walked calmly beside me and addressed the room professionally. Evelyn Mitchell documented concerns regarding financial misconduct connected to the estate prior to her passing. Dad looked furious now. You had no right. I have every legal right, Daniel interrupted firmly. Then he opened the folder. And one by one, everything collapsed. The withdrawals. The transfers. The letters. The recordings. The co-executor documents naming me. Every carefully hidden truth spilled into the open. Nobody defended my father anymore. Nobody. Not even Brittany. She just cried silently staring at the floor while relatives whispered around her. And suddenly I realized something strange. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Because revenge keeps you emotionally attached to people. Truth doesn't. Truth just ends things. My father looked at me one final time. And I swear his expression wasn't guilt. It was disbelief. Like he genuinely never imagined I'd stop being quiet. But my grandmother knew. That's why she prepared everything. Because she understood something about me long before I did. Quiet people eventually reach a limit too. A month later I moved into a smaller apartment across town. Not because I lost anything. Because I wanted peace. The estate settled slowly through attorneys and legal negotiations. The house was sold properly, assets divided fairly, and multiple relatives stopped speaking to my father altogether after learning the full truth. Brittany called me several times after that. Sometimes crying. Sometimes apologizing. Sometimes just sitting silently on the phone because neither of us fully knew how to rebuild a relationship after this kind of damage. I forgave her eventually. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. As for my father, we haven't spoken in 8 months. And honestly, for the first time in my life the silence feels healthy. I used part of the settlement money to start a respiratory outreach program for elderly patients who can't afford in-home recovery equipment after hospital discharge. Something meaningful. Something real. The kind of thing my grandmother would have loved. And sometimes late at night I still replay that original phone call in my head. Not because it hurts anymore. But because it reminds me of something important. The moment people become comfortable disrespecting you openly. That's usually the moment they've mistaken your kindness for weakness. If you've ever been treated like the invisible one in your family, the dependable one nobody appreciates until you stop showing up, I want you to know something. You are not difficult for wanting respect. You are not selfish for setting boundaries. And staying silent does not make you a better daughter, sister, or person if that silence is destroying you. Thank you for listening to my story. And if any part of this connected with you, I'd really love to hear your experience in the comments. Stories like these remind people they're not alone more than you probably realize. And if you enjoy emotional family stories about betrayal, healing, resilience, and finding your voice after years of being overlooked, don't forget to subscribe. Because sometimes the quietest people have the most powerful stories once they finally decide to tell the truth.